Everyone knows the economy for the average American sucks right now. It doesn't matter how many graphs that show numbers go up, when in reality, we are all feeling the crunch. A lot of people point out the issues that we see on a day-to-day or year-on-year basis, but few will point out where we are in the grand scheme of things. Few will point to the much larger cycle of expansion and contraction that has quietly dictated the strength of economies all throughout history. Yet, if you look at history and where we are now, you will see all the same patterns and signs that dictate where we are headed. One of the few who do see the pattern is a guy named Peter Turchin, and using mathematical models which he applied to population dynamics, he discovered a clear pattern that every civilization followed. From agricultural to post-industrial, every civilization faces the same challenges as it relates to economic output. Peter Turchin called this pattern the secular cycle. In this video, I will outline each of the 4 phases of the cycle, then we will look at the 3 secular cycles of America that we have already completed. Lastly, we will see where we are in the current cycle and make some predictions based on this model to see where we might be headed. There are 4 phases of the secular cycle. First, we have the expansion phase. Keep in mind though, you will not have an expansion until a society has created a strong moral foundation, which is an essential precursor for all civilizations. Without that, humans would fail to cooperate enough to create an economic expansion in the first place. Check out my last video for a full breakdown on that. Once a moral foundation is established, you get a population boom. Suddenly, you have all of these new mouths to feed. So what does the fledgling civilization do? They solve that problem by creating or refining an economic engine for growth. Examples of that can include agricultural intensification, where farming techniques are improved and systematized to increase output. You can also have bureaucratic expansion, which refines the sovereign system at large to be more efficient, creating a surplus of resources. You could also build new infrastructure for trade, like the Roman roads, which made long-distance trade safer, stimulating growth. You could also just go around killing neighboring peoples and taking their stuff forcefully through conquest. In reality though, most civilizations use a combination of these economic engines depending on their situation. China, for example, didn't have too many neighboring nations, so they relied on internal systems and agricultural techniques to drive growth. On the other hand, the Islamic Caliphate was in the middle of the desert. They didn't exactly have the option to expand agriculture enough to feed all the new mouths, so they relied on conquest and then expanded trade and bureaucratic systems off the corpse of the Roman Empire. Whatever economic engine they chose, it eventually created high-trust societies, strong upward mobility, and new and expanding institutions. Then the next phase, stagflation. To understand this, you need to know a very important principle. Economic growth is roughly linear. However, when you combine strong demographics by population boom with high aspirations by incoming generations of youth, you get an exponential curve. As more and more kids are born into a time of seemingly limitless economic opportunities, you get a fast-growing population of elite aspirants. This isn't a problem at first because there are still so many opportunities available for these aspirants. But when this exponential curve crosses the economic growth curve, competition grows for an ever-shrinking amount of opportunities in the system. This is called elite overproduction. Too many ambitious people seeking high status, and too few positions of status for them to occupy. When this happens, you get a growing class of people who are educated, but their upward mobility that they were promised is no longer possible. I did everything right, but I'm still stuck. Sound familiar? This class of elite aspirants creates pressure in the system, and usually that quest for status gets redirected into politics, culture, and institutions. Elite overproduction is a failure of large numbers of credentialed people to gain status, and then scramble to reclaim it elsewhere. Another characteristic of stagflation is popular immiseration. As a result of the economic slowdown, combined with population increases in general, you get an economic squeeze that leads to wage stagnation, increased cost of living, and general economic insecurity. Sound familiar? More on that later. The third major pressure that builds in the stagflation phase is state fiscal stress. With less economic output, you get a decreasing tax base, and you now have to use state spending on social programs to maintain stability. As a result of that, state debt increases as well. Sound familiar? Okay, I'm done. These three pressures of stagflation rise slowly. They don't immediately destabilize the system, it's more like a boiling pot. When you turn up the heat, nothing changes on the surface, but as time goes on, you start to see bubbles forming on the bottom. Then, all of a sudden, they rise to the surface, and now the pot is violently shaking as the water boils over. Only when the pot shakes do we enter the next phase of the cycle: crisis. Population immiseration peaks to the point that people lose trust in the system entirely. This leads to wide-scale protests, radicalization, and a general disengagement with the system. The elite class also engage in open conflict, using levers of power to fight and extract as much power and wealth from the failing system. You also see state fiscal stress peak, sometimes leading to failure of governance. Emergency policies act as band-aids while legitimacy collapses. Not only are the people living paycheck to paycheck, but so too is the government. Over the crisis period, these issues get progressively worse, eventually culminating into a moment of truth. This moment, which typically happens near the end of the crisis phase, typically has four paths. First, we have a full-blown revolution. Where the previous elite class is overthrown, violence erupts, and when the dust finally settles, the system gets a hard reset. The second path would be civil war, where elites split on ideological lines and battle for control. The third is authoritarian consolidation, where the exhausted populace trades their freedom in favor of stability, as the government uses heavy-handed tactics to overcorrect on the crisis. Lastly, we have a full economic reset, followed by a depression phase, where the existing political system stays largely intact, but the economic fallout creates a lengthy economic depression that could take decades to come back from. Something else that is important to consider at this point is that there is never a guarantee a civilization makes it past their crisis. As bad as those four paths sound, those were the good options. The final option would be total collapse, where there's no more centralized authority, and the remnants of the civilization either fractures into regional powers or cease to exist entirely. Assuming that doesn't happen, we get the fourth phase of the secular cycle, the depression/intercycle phase. This is where the restructuring actually happens. The elite class get pruned through bankruptcy, downsizing, and political restructuring. The economy gets cleared, with weak companies failing, bad debt written off or inflated away, and asset prices reset. The economy is essentially dropping all of the dead weight. There is a collapse of expectations as well. People consume less and save more, living a simpler life. You would think they would have done that seeing the writing on the wall during the crisis phase, but believe it or not, people actually tend to spend more during crisis and only cut back during the depression phase. Once this restructure is complete, and the three pressures of crisis, that being elite overproduction, population immiseration, and state fiscal stress, are relieved, a new economic expansion can begin, thus beginning the next cycle. Believe it or not, America has already been through three of these cycles. You might have heard of a full secular cycle lasting between 200 and 300 years, but that was only true of agrarian societies. Post-industrial societies move much faster, with a full cycle lasting about 80 to 100 years. The first cycle began during the colonial era and eventually culminated into the American Revolution. The American colonies were originally settled in the early 1600s, but the necessary ingredients to begin an expansion didn't arrive until the early 1700s. Early colonial life was brutal, with famine, disease, and poor infrastructure. They did have a strong moral foundation and solid birth rates, but they couldn't get off the ground until they had stability. By the early 1700s, survival rates increased dramatically, and combined with already strong birth rates, you get a population explosion. Farming techniques improved, transatlantic trade routes secured, and land was still cheap, creating a powerful economic engine for expansion. And most importantly, opportunities exceeded aspirants. Then we enter Phase 2, stagflation, roughly between 1763 to 1773. It began with the end of the 7 Years' War. Britain was heavily in debt, and to compensate, they started extracting more from the colonies. The old taxation without representation slogan came from this time period as well. By this point, prime real estate on coastal areas were also basically saturated, adding to the economic squeeze. Elite competition played a role as well. By the mid-1700s, the colonies had produced a growing class of lawyers, merchants, and political leaders whose ambitions were constrained by British imperial rule. While elite overproduction wasn't the primary driver of the crisis, these colonial elites became the architects of the revolution. These pressures quickly boiled over into Phase 3, crisis, beginning in 1773 with the Boston Tea Party. Now the pressure has boiled over into open conflict, and Britain's legitimacy over the colonies is being challenged. This quickly escalated into a full-blown revolution by 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord. We officially declared our independence in 1776, otherwise known as America's birthday, baby. Woo! The war ended in 1783, where Britain recognized our independence and our awesomeness. Even though the crisis is over, things did not go smoothly for America right away. The first government framework was weak and ineffective, so they went back to the drawing board and created a new constitution at the United States Constitutional Convention in 1787. It took time for things to stabilize, but by the mid-1790s, the fledgling civilization completed its first cycle and was ready for its first expansion phase as a newly minted country. When things stabilized in the early 1800s, another demographic boom happened, powered by high fertility and immigration. The Louisiana Purchase opened up a new frontier of cheap land, agricultural output expanded, and industrialization began. These became the new economic engine powering expansion, where once again, opportunity exceeded aspirants. Then, Phase 2, stagnation, hits quickly from 1820 to 1850. Land became saturated again, elite overproduction intensifies with an explosion of higher education, creating a large class of lawyers, politicians, editors, clergy, and other professionals, with fewer and fewer positions available to fill. You also see a growing divide between the political class of the North and South, planting the seeds of what's to come. The northern elites lean heavily into rapid industrialization, while the southern elites hold on to their agricultural power. Popular immiseration also hits the general population, with urban crowding in northern cities, stagnating wages, and increasing competition from immigrant labor. The state also begins to buckle under the pressure. Federal compromises get harder, legislative paralysis increases, and Supreme Court rulings intensify conflict, such as with the Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. These three pressures boil over into crisis. From 1850 to 1860, elite conflict became irreconcilable. Key points of escalation along ideological lines include violent clashes between pro- and anti-slavery groups in Bleeding, Kansas, and the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision to allow slavery to expand westward. The crisis phase eventually culminated into a moment of truth, with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who ran on stopping the spread of slavery into the new frontier. A month after he was elected, South Carolina seceded from the nation, and by Lincoln's inauguration, 6 more had joined in forming the Confederate States of America. The war kicked off a month later in the Battle of Fort Sumter, where another 4 states seceded and joined the Confederacy. Now, I don't have time to give a play-by-play, but by the time this ended in 1865, about 600,000 were dead in the conflict, and the Confederacy was ultimately defeated. America was able to hold together and thus begin its next phase of the cycle, Depression. Between 1865 and 1880, better known as the Reconstruction era, the economy in America was in shambles, especially in the South, which has just lost its main economic engine. There was an elite restructuring in the South, with plantation owners losing power and the federal government's consolidating power. There was also major institutional reform, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which freed the slaves and redefined citizenship. Once the system stabilized, America was ready to begin its next cycle. Now, we're entering the Gilded Age cycle. Phase 1 expansion was roughly between 1870 and 1900. Previous expansions were largely led by land grabs on new frontier land, but by this point, most of the land had already been settled. America needed a new frontier, and so we decided to focus on industrialization. Railroads unified the nation, creating the national market. Steel, oil, and manufacturing surge. Urbanization accelerates. There was also a massive population boom fueled by strong birth rates and massive immigration from Europe. How big of a population boom? The population of America more than tripled between the Civil War and the early 20th century, including about 23 million immigrants. America became the global industrial leader with massive gains in productivity and GDP. Above all else, opportunities were seemingly limitless, which means, once again, opportunity exceeded aspirants. Then, stagnation hits. From 1900 to the 1910s, elite overproduction intensifies with an explosion of college-educated professionals. Rapid growth of universities producing lawyers, journalists, professors, reformers, and political activists. Popular immiseration also intensified with urban crowding, dangerous factory working conditions, wage stagnation, and rising inequality. This fueled labor unrest, strikes, and populist movements that would grow slowly before erupting violently during the crisis phase. There was also state fiscal and governance stress, as the federal government was unable to keep up with managing industrial complexity. Now, a lot of people assume that the crisis phase must have been the stock market crash of 1929, but that was actually technically the end of the crisis. It technically started before the market crash in the early 1910s. Working conditions and the fight between the common worker and the business tycoons was building up throughout this decade and became increasingly more violent until it hit a boiling point in 1919. 4 million workers went on strike, which represented 10 to 15% of the entire labor market at the time. Elites were clashing as well, with industrial magnates in conflict with reformers. Labor organizers versus corporate interests. While the system was becoming unstable at home, we also had external pressure in the form of World War I. Government spending increased dramatically, as did the national debt. We also saw racial violence, with race riots erupting all over the states, most notably in Chicago during the 1919 Red Summer. This only added to the social fragmentation of American society at large. Things did calm down for a bit during the Roaring '20s, but this was only a facade, hiding instability under a mountain of consumer debt and financed spending. This would prove to be a poor temporary solution, as by 1929 the facade came crumbling down. The financial bubble that had been building for years burst, and the pressure that had been building for years finally collapsed the system. Then we quickly entered the next phase, the Great Depression. Only it was not so great. It was painful. America needed a total overhaul of our financial system. In comes FDR and his New Deal. He created banking reform, regulation for the financial markets, labor rebalancing, and social safety nets. This created the foundation to repair the system, but it did not solve things immediately. The Depression dragged on for a decade as Americans struggled to get by. As people were scraping by here in America, trouble had been brewing at the same time. By 1939, that trouble had escalated into another full-blown world war, and by 1941, America got involved. Now, I'm not going to cover the details of the war here, but what is important to note is that the war mobilization effort stimulated the economy tremendously, with unemployment being wiped out virtually overnight. By the end of the war, America was ready to begin its next cycle, our current cycle. By the end of the war, America was basically the only industrial power in the world left standing. This created an immense opportunity, as we were perfectly positioned to lead the world as the dominant industrial superpower, leading the world into a new age, globalization, the new frontier. This expansion cycle was driven by mass industrial production, suburbanization, expansion of the interstate highway, and technological advancements. The middle class was strong, with low income inequality, plenty of well-paying manufacturing jobs, easy home ownership opportunities, God, I wonder what that must have been like, and, most importantly, real upward mobility, which relieved popular immiseration. And once again, opportunity exceeded aspirants. The system was also stable, with government institutions, media, and corporations all in alignment, working like a well-oiled machine. This, however, did not last, and so came stagflation between 1970 and the early 2000s. There was an economic slowdown, hampering productivity and growth. Inflation rises, and wages begin to stagnate. Global competition also increases as other industrial powers were finally rebuilt after World War II, like Europe and Japan. Manufacturing jobs shipped overseas. Elite overproduction also began as there was another massive expansion of higher education. The professional class grew in areas such as law, academia, media, politics, and corporate leadership. Inequality also grew as a result of wage stagnation, creating an increase in popular immiseration. There was also a financialization of our economy. Economic growth increasingly relied on finance, credit, and asset bubbles instead of real productivity. Americans also began losing trust in their institutions after the Vietnam War, Watergate, and economic instability. Then, in 2008, we began the next phase of the cycle, the phase that we are still in at this very moment: crisis. The 2008 financial crisis revealed the fragility of our system. Our financial system was over-leveraged, just as it was during the previous cycle. The housing asset bubble burst, sending the stock market into chaos. Unlike the previous collapse, however, we did something very different. The government bailed out the banks instead of letting them fail, which prevented rapid collapse, opting instead for a slow burn. We kicked the can down the road, but eventually we will pay that price. Elite conflict also escalated in the years following. Intense political polarization, open lawfare, bending the rule of law to defeat political opponents, and escalating ideological conflict. Just as Peter Turchin predicted, this would escalate in the 2020s, and we are still not done yet. Popular immiseration is also at an all-time high. Declining purchasing power for families, rising housing and education costs, and now job insecurity. I don't think I need to elaborate because we are all feeling this right now. We also have state fiscal stress as our government debt is right now around $38 trillion. Enough said on that one. Lastly, we are increasingly seeing social unrest in the form of large protest movements, ideological radicalization, and complete and open distrust of our institutions as a whole. So, where do we go from here? This question is impossible to answer. No one knows with certainty the direction we will go. Crisis phases tend to create a bit of a crossroads. There are multiple diverging paths in front of us, and any significant event can take us down any one of these overnight. I will give you my 5 pathways I see us going down, but before we do, I would be a fool not to think about the AI revolution and its impacts on this moment. Every single path in front of us involves AI, as it will inevitably change the nature of our economy and the nature of work dramatically. In my mind, it's not a question of if AI will change the course of humanity, but when, and will it be for better or worse. I will not be able to go into depth in this video, so I will do another video with a deeper dive into possible futures. But for now, the first path, the AI frontier. Jobs are replaced at a rapid rate, causing widespread disruptions to the system. The government, of course, fails to act quickly to the changing landscape, but eventually, after say maybe 5 or 10 years, they are able to catch up and stabilize the system. New reforms and institutions are created to relieve the 3 pressures of crisis, that would be population immiseration, elite overproduction, and fiscal pressures. Perhaps even an implementation of UBI, Universal Basic Income. This path is best case scenario, but even then, we can expect a lot of pain and rapid destabilization before our course is corrected and a new era of expansion led by AI can begin. This would be a similar reset to the Great Depression. The second path is AI-generated wealth concentration. This is very similar to the first path, only this time, instead of productivity gains being distributed, it concentrates in the hands of a few wealthy elites. Extreme inequality, high political polarization, and declining trust in institutions. This could drag on for decades, maybe even indefinitely, if no solution is found. The third path is political rupture. This is like the previous path, only instead of things dragging on, we will instead have a total collapse in the functioning of our institutions. This could take the form of a revolution, a constitutional reset, or an authoritarian takeover to overcompensate and restore order. This might be the second worst case scenario, as it would be very chaotic and violent, but I also don't think this is as likely to happen as the previous two. The fourth path, long stagnation. This would be similar to the path Japan is on right now, where there is a long period of minimal growth and limited upward mobility. There is no new economic expansion phase, but the system still functions. Pressure also increases on younger generations as they are left supporting the system of an aging population. We would be trading growth for stability. The fifth path, and the worst path, total collapse. So far, we've talked about things in terms of a large cycle that once completed will simply begin anew. But that is not a guarantee. People think that we have become too big to fail. Have we? I wonder if the Romans believe the same. I'm not saying this is likely, but it's certainly possible. It is possible that America as we know it will not survive this moment of crisis. The state fails to resolve internal conflicts. The country fragments into distinct regions with no more central authority. We could even see technocratic feudalism, where corporate powers surpass that of the state and then control their own regions of the leftover fragments that used to be the United States. We are at a crossroads. The path forward is very uncertain. The system is unstable, and even a single event could be the catalyst to pull us down any of these paths before us. Even though there is a lot of uncertainty in our future, the one thing that is certain is that things will not be the same when all is said and done. Stay safe out there.